March 28, 1945. The war in Europe was supposed to be over. The once invincible German army was a shattered remnant, collapsing in on itself. American tanks were advancing almost unopposed through the picturesque Bavarian countryside. For the battle-hardened soldiers of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, rolling toward the ancient city of Aschaffenburg that morning, the expectation was of another peaceful surrender, another white flag, another step closer to home. That expectation died the moment their jeeps rolled to a halt at the city's outskirts. Their eyes were drawn not to defensive barricades, but to the ornate lampposts lining the approach road. Hanging from them, like grotesque ornaments, were bodies. Dozens of them. They weren't soldiers in field gray. They were civilians. Old men in worn suit coats. Women in faded dresses. Boys and girls who looked no older than 16. Each corpse swayed gently in the damp spring air, a crude sign tied around its neck bearing the same damning, hand-scrawled accusation: "Here hanged ein Verräter." Here hangs a traitor, their crime. Believing the Americans would bring liberation, not destruction. In a desperate bid to save their homes and families, they had hung white bedsheets from their windows, the universal signal of surrender. For this act of perceived betrayal, their own commander had ordered them executed and displayed as a warning. The American soldiers, men who had fought from Sicily to the gates of Germany, stared in a silence that was not sorrow, but a cold, building fury. They looked past the grisly spectacle to the city ahead. Aschaffenburg was a storybook vision of medieval Germany, a fortress town of timber-framed houses clustered beneath the imposing, red sandstone bulk of Schloss Johannesburg. It was beautiful, historic, and utterly damned. In that moment, the mission changed. This would not be a careful urban assault to capture Aschaffenburg intact. They would not spill their blood in treacherous street-by-street fighting for a city whose leadership murdered its own people for wanting peace. The American field commander, his face set in a grim mask, picked up the radio handset. He didn't call for tactical infantry support. He didn't request a precision aerial strike. He called for everything. He called for the heavy artillery, the long-range guns, the tank destroyers. His message was effectively a sentence of execution: level it. Turn every building into dust. If they want to die for Hitler, let's help them. This is the true story of the destruction of Aschaffenburg. It is the story of the day the U.S. Army, pushed beyond the limits of conventional warfare, decided to stop playing by the rules. It is the day they encountered a fanatical Nazi true believer who refused to acknowledge defeat, and the brutal, overwhelming punishment they delivered to his city. To understand why a historic city was deliberately erased from the map, we must first meet the architect of its ruin, the villain of this piece, Major Emil Lamberty. Lamberty was not a typical German officer in the war's waning days. While most commanders, pragmatically recognizing the inevitable, sought to surrender with what dignity they could to spare their men and their cities, Lamberty was a fanatic, a devout believer in National Socialism to its apocalyptic conclusion. By late March 1945, the Reich was in its death throes. The Allied armies were across the Rhine. Yet, Lamberty had been given command of Aschaffenburg, a critical transportation hub on the main river, and with it, he carried a personal, sacred order from Adolf Hitler himself: Festung Aschaffenburg, Fortress Aschaffenburg, was to be defended, to the last stone. Lamberty took this command literally, with a chilling, inhuman fervor. The 20,000 civilians trapped within the city's ancient walls were not his charges to protect, they were either tools for his defense or obstacles to his fanaticism. The city's storied history, dating back over a millennium, was irrelevant. Only obedience to the Führer's will mattered. His forces were a pathetic yet dangerous mosaic of desperation, a ragged corps of weary regular army troops bolstered by the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, consisting of old men armed with antiquated hunting rifles, boys of the Hitler Youth barely 15, and convalescent soldiers dragged from hospital beds. To this hastily assembled garrison, Lamberty issued a terrifying edict. Anyone attempting to surrender would be shot. Anyone displaying a white flag would be hanged. There would be no quarter given and none asked for. "We will fight," he declared, until the Americans are dead or we are dead. The citizens of Aschaffenburg were paralyzed with terror. They heard the thunder of American artillery drawing nearer. They saw the futility of resistance. In secret, behind shuttered windows, housewives and shopkeepers stitched together white flags from bedsheets and tablecloths, praying for a swift and bloodless end. But Lamberty's network of informants and enforcers was everywhere. On the morning of March 28, as American scouts appeared in the suburbs, Lamberty's death squads enacted his grim decree. They stormed into homes, dragging civilians into the streets. No trials were held, no pleas heard. Rough nooses were thrown over the wrought iron lamp posts, and the traitors were hanged, their lifeless bodies left on grotesque display for the advancing Americans and their own cowed neighbors. Thus, when the lead elements of the 45th Division cautiously entered Aschaffenburg's outskirts, they were not met with a city seeking salvation. They were met with a city held in the grip of a madman, a city where the very population had been transformed into combatants under threat of death. The initial American patrols moved down eerily quiet streets. Then, a single shot cracked the silence. It was followed by the staccato burst of a machine gun, then the whoosh and crump of a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket. The Americans dove for cover, but the fire came from everywhere, from the spire of the St. Peter and Alexander Church, from cellar windows, from sewer grates. Most horrifyingly, the faces behind the weapons were not those of hardened soldiers. They were the faces of civilians. An old man in a business suit fired a hunting rifle from a second-story window. A woman dropped a grenade from a rooftop. A child, his face pale with fear, clumsily aimed a rifle. Major Lamberty had successfully, through terror, mobilized the entire population. He had filled their heads with Nazi propaganda, telling them the Americans would rape and murder them all if they gave up. He had turned a historic city into a death trap where every doorway could conceal a sniper and every civilian was a potential assassin. The American soldiers, trained to fight armies, were morally disoriented. They hesitated to return fire into homes, to shoot at women and children. In war, hesitation is often fatal. Casualties began to mount, experienced infantrymen cut down by a populace they had come to liberate. Ambulance jeeps made frantic, dangerous runs back to aid stations. What was supposed to be a simple occupation had become a bloody, chaotic meat grinder in a maze of narrow alleys. At the American command post outside the city, the reports filtered in, and the commander's anger hardened into something colder and more decisive. They were losing good men who had survived Normandy and the Colmar pocket to a militia of terrified civilians. And then came the final, incendiary report from their scouts, confirmation of the hanged civilians, murdered by their own for the simple desire for peace. This atrocity severed the last thread of restraint. The American commander, likely Colonel Felix Sparks, whose battalion was heavily engaged, studied the map of Aschaffenburg. His eyes settled on the immense Schloss Johannesburg, the 17th-century castle that loomed over the city and the main river. That, intelligence suggested, was Lamberty's command bunker. A medieval solution would involve a costly infantry assault on that stone fortress. The American commander chose a 20th-century solution. He would not sacrifice another soldier in those murderous streets. He would not play a game of knights and castles with a fanatic. He would employ the overwhelming technological advantage of the U.S. Army, sheer, brutal, explosive force. The order went out, pull back. Disengage from close combat. We are not going to capture this city house by house, we are going to dismantle it brick by brick. What followed was not a battle but a systematic demolition. The Americans called up their heaviest weapons. From the surrounding hills, batteries of 155 mm long tom artillery pieces were manhandled into direct fire positions. These guns, designed to fire over miles in a high arc, were now lowered until their barrels were almost horizontal. They were aimed point-blank at the cityscape. Alongside them rumbled the M12 gun motor carriage, a feared weapon nicknamed the King of Battle, a 155 mm gun mounted on a Sherman tank chassis, a mobile siege engine. The bombardment that commenced was apocalyptic in its scale and deliberation. This was not harassing fire or tactical suppression, it was eradication. The heavy guns fired methodically, block by block, house by house. The 155mm high-explosive shells, weighing nearly 100 pounds, did not simply damage the centuries-old timber-framed buildings, they vaporized them. Whole structures vanished in geysers of splintered wood, pulverized plaster, and shattered brick. Fires erupted, fanned by the spring wind, and soon entire rows of homes were consumed in an inferno. Overhead, flights of P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers dove through the smoke, adding their payloads of bombs and napalm to the cataclysm below. The sky turned black with ash, and the air trembled with a continuous, rolling thunder. Inside the city, it was hell on earth. Civilians who had not fled or been executed cowered in cellars as their world collapsed above them. Lamberty's teenage Volkssturm and convalescent soldiers, hiding in ruins, were buried alive or torn apart by concussive blasts. Yet, from his reinforced bunker deep beneath the castle, Major Lamberty remained defiant. Radioing his scattered units, he shouted encouragement, misreading the American withdrawal as weakness. "They are afraid to fight us man to man," he proclaimed. But the Americans were not afraid. They were ruthlessly pragmatic. They had calculated that the city itself was now a legitimate military target, a hostile stronghold that refused to capitulate. An American sergeant, watching the spectacle from the safety of the high ground, captured the grim sentiment in his diary, "We just sat on the hill and watched it burn. After seeing those people hanging from the lampposts, I didn't feel a thing. They brought this on themselves." This shift in psyche, from liberator to avenging destroyer, lies at the dark heart of the Aschaffenburg story. For days, the relentless bombardment continued, reducing the postcard-perfect old town to a smoldering wasteland of rubble and skeletal building frames. Yet, through the smoke and ruin, the hulking mass of Schloss Johannesburg still stood, its thick walls defiant. This was Lamberty's final redoubt. The Americans moved in for the kill, but again, they refused a direct infantry assault. Instead, they maneuvered an M12 gun motor carriage through the debris-choked streets until it was parked directly in front of the castle's main gate, a modern-day cannon brought to batter down a medieval fortress. German defenders peering from the castle's arrow slits saw the massive gun barrel, mere yards away, being loaded. The first 155mm shell struck the central tower with a cataclysmic roar. Centuries-old sandstone exploded inward. The Americans fired round after round, methodically punching holes through walls that had withstood the elements for over 300 years. The castle began to burn. Inside, the scene was one of utter carnage and despair. Wounded soldiers and Hitler Youth boys screamed in the dust-choked darkness. The roof timbers, set ablaze by incendiary shells, crashed down. Finally, the will of Lamberty's men broke. They begged their major to surrender, to end the madness. Lamberty's response was to brandish his pistol, threatening to shoot his own cowards. But the mutiny was complete. On the morning of April 3, after nearly a week of siege, the firing from the castle ceased. A grimy white flag, perhaps another bedsheet, was waved from a jagged hole in the fortress wall. The American guns fell silent. A pathetic procession emerged from the wreckage. First came the shell-shocked survivors, boys, old men, and wounded soldiers, their uniforms caked in the distinctive red dust of pulverized sandstone, looking more like ghosts than combatants. Then, finally, came Major Emil Lamberty. He had meticulously donned his full dress uniform, his medals gleaming absurdly against the backdrop of total ruin. He walked with a stiff, arrogant bearing, the unrepentant Nazi to the last. He approached the American commander, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, the very officer who would, just weeks later, help liberate the Dachau concentration camp. Lamberty offered a formal, martial salute and began to speak, no doubt of soldierly honor and duty to one's nation. Colonel Sparks did not return the salute. He looked past Lamberty at the utter devastation of Aschaffenburg, the still smoldering ruins, the bodies of civilians caught in the crossfire, the monumental waste. He thought of his own men who had died fighting a war that was already won. In a moment of pure, unvarnished contempt, Sparks cut him off. He turned to his military policeman and growled an order that has echoed through history: "Get this bastard out of my sight before I shoot him myself." Lamberty was disarmed, stripped of his insignia, and shoved into the back of a jeep. As he was driven away through the ruins, a final judgment was passed. The surviving citizens of Aschaffenburg, emerging from their cellars to survey the annihilation of their home, saw their former commander. They did not salute or weep for him. They spat. They shook their fists. They screamed the word that would forever be his epitaph: "Mortar. Murderer. You destroyed our city." The battle for Aschaffenburg lasted 10 brutal days. It should have lasted 10 hours. Because of one man's ideological fanaticism, a historic city was approximately 85% destroyed. Hundreds of civilians lay dead, alongside hundreds of American and German combatants. When General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, toured the still-smoking ruins, he was characteristically blunt. Surveying the mountains of rubble, he reportedly stated, "It is a good lesson. If they choose to fight, this is what happens. We will not trade American lives for German buildings." Patton, ever the strategist, immediately leveraged the horror of Aschaffenburg as a psychological weapon. For the remainder of the war, as the Third Army drove deeper into Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, they would send emissaries or messages ahead to undefended towns: "Remember Aschaffenburg. Surrender or be destroyed." The tactic, born of horrific necessity, proved brutally effective. Countless towns, their mayors and citizens recalling the images of Aschaffenburg's fate, chose immediate, unconditional surrender, undoubtedly saving thousands of American and German lives in the war's final, senseless weeks. The city's destruction became a terrible, cautionary tale that prevented further, wider destruction. And what of Major Emil Lamberty, the man who hanged his own people and doomed his city? His fate provides a measure of postscript justice. He was not processed as an ordinary prisoner of war. He was arrested and put on trial, not for killing American soldiers, an act of war, but for the murder of the German civilians he had ordered hanged. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Though, in the chaotic legal recalibrations of the post-war period, his sentence was later commuted to imprisonment. He lived, but he lived in disgrace, reviled by the very people he claimed to defend, a forgotten man in a new Germany that wanted to forget everything he represented. The destruction of Aschaffenburg remains a stark, uncomfortable chapter in the history of the Second World War. It is not a tale of glorious victory or heroic liberation. It is a story of the terrible, inexorable logic of total war, where mercy and restraint can be eroded by atrocity and fanaticism. The American soldiers at Aschaffenburg did not set out to be destroyers of culture. They were pushed to that brink by a commander who valued a dead ideology more than living humanity, who used his own citizens as human shields and then executed them as traitors. When confronted with such absolute, inhuman intransigence, the American response was absolute, overwhelming force. They stopped trying to save the city and decided to annihilate the threat it contained. It serves as a grim reminder that there is a limit to restraint. Push an army, or a man, too far beyond the norms of civilized conflict, and you will not receive negotiation. You will receive a 155 mm high explosive shell through your city gate. The American commander made the calculus that saving the lives of his soldiers justified the total destruction of a hostile fortress city. Was it the right choice? Was it a necessary act of war or a disproportionate one? The debate endures, a complex moral equation set against the backdrop of a war's brutal, final act. The ruins of Aschaffenburg, and the ghosts on its lamp posts, force us to ask the hardest of questions about the price of victory and the lines we cross when faced with an enemy who recognizes none.